For years, Harbor Freight was known as the cheap tool store people relied on when budgets were tight. But over time, something about that reputation began to quietly change. Prices started creeping up on items that were once impulse buys. Some tools failed sooner than expected, even under light use. Return counters grew busier, and warranties became part of the purchase decision. What began as minor inconveniences slowly turned into real frustration for customers. At the same time, store employees faced higher return volumes, suppliers adjusted materials, and the business model itself came under pressure. So what's really happening behind Harbor Freight's famously low prices? The answer isn't found on the shelf or the price tag, but in cost-cutting decisions most customers never see. In this video, we reveal how Harbor Freight keeps tools so cheap, why that strategy creates hidden risks, and which tools you should avoid if you want to protect your money and your projects. Harbor Freight entered the market with a simple, practical promise: tools that ordinary people could afford. At a time when many hardware retailers focused on professional contractors and premium brands, Harbor Freight positioned itself differently. It offered access. If something broke at home, if a car needed a quick repair, or if a one-time project appeared unexpectedly, the store provided a solution that didn't require a major financial decision. The appeal wasn't durability measured in decades. It was immediacy. Harbor Freight tools were designed for DIY projects, emergency fixes, and occasional use. Jobs where spending several times more on a professional-grade tool didn't make sense. For many customers, these tools weren't symbols of craftsmanship. They were problem solvers: a jack to change a tire, a drill for a weekend shelf, a grinder for a single repair. This created a specific emotional value. The brand felt practical and democratic. You didn't need deep knowledge of tools, long research sessions, or brand loyalty to walk in and buy what you needed. The low prices lowered the barrier to action. Projects felt possible instead of postponed. Mistakes felt less costly. Experimentation felt allowed. Importantly, the low price itself wasn't seen as a warning sign. It was understood as the trade-off. Customers accepted that the tools might be heavier, less refined, or shorter-lived. That expectation was built into the relationship. The savings justified the limitations. In that early understanding, Harbor Freight wasn't competing on prestige or perfection. It competed on usefulness. As long as the tool completed the task and the price stayed clearly below alternatives, the equation worked. The brand earned trust, not by promising excellence, but by reliably delivering good enough at a price that made sense. What often goes unnoticed about Harbor Freight is that it is not a small discount retailer operating on the margins of the tool industry. Over decades, the company expanded steadily across the United States, building a dense network of stores that now reaches most mid-sized cities and suburban regions. This expansion wasn't rapid or flashy, but it was deliberate. Store by store, Harbor Freight became a default option for affordable tools in many local markets. Alongside physical growth came structural power. Harbor Freight is almost entirely built on private label brands. Names like Pittsburgh, Bauer, Hercules, and Icon are not independent manufacturers competing for shelf space. They are controlled within the same system. This model gives the company unusual leverage. Design choices, material specifications, supplier selection, and pricing are all negotiated at scale, not tool by tool. Decisions made once can affect millions of units. Volume is the key to this system. Harbor Freight doesn't rely on selling a few expensive tools. It relies on moving enormous quantities of inexpensive ones. That volume changes the math. Manufacturing partners compete for contracts measured in container loads, not batches. Small cost reductions, fractions of a dollar per unit, become significant when multiplied across hundreds of stores and millions of sales. This is where scale turns simple products into systemic forces. A wrench or drill, on its own, seems insignificant. But when millions of similar tools are produced, shipped, and sold under the same constraints, the consequences compound. A small design compromise becomes a widespread experience. A minor material change affects thousands of users simultaneously. At this scale, Harbor Freight is no longer just a place to buy cheap tools. It is a powerful retail system whose internal decisions shape expectations, behavior, and outcomes across an entire segment of the market. AMD has always been behind VDA far behind. While both build AI GPUs, every major lab chased Jensen Huang and ignored Lisa Su. But that might be changing. OpenAI just signed a $100 billion infrastructure deal, not with NVIDIA, but with AMD. A 10% stake, a massive risk. What changed, and is NVIDIA's monopoly finally breaking? For nearly a decade, NVIDIA didn't just dominate the GPU market, it owned it. In the second quarter of 2025, their share of AI GPUs hit 94%. AMD, just 6%. And what's worse, NVIDIA's grip wasn't shrinking, it was tightening. The secret wasn't only faster chips or better marketing, it was something invisible but far more powerful. CUDA. Short for Compute Unified Device Architecture, it's the quiet empire NVIDIA built around its hardware. Launched back in 2007, CUDA allowed developers to use NVIDIA GPUs for far more than graphics from physics simulations to deep learning models. It became the default language of modern AI. Think of it like this. AMD sold a great instrument. NVIDIA built the entire orchestra. CUDA came with endless library, tutorials, integrations, and most importantly, time. Thousands of researchers learned on it. Every paper, every benchmark, every data was optimized for it. By the time AMD entered the AI race, the world had already standardized on NVIDIA's rules. That's what made CUDA the true moat, a software fortress wrapped around silicon. It wasn't just about power, it was about inertia. Once the world writes billions of lines of code for your system, switching becomes nearly impossible. It's the same reason companies still run on Windows decades after better systems appeared. Familiarity, innovation. AMD's hardware wasn't bad, in fact, it was often cheaper and competitive. The growing inconsistency in Harbor Freight tools didn't stem from randomness or neglect. It followed a predictable logic rooted in private label manufacturing. Because Harbor Freight controls its brands, it doesn't operate with a single, fixed manufacturer for each product. Instead, production is often distributed across multiple OEMs, sometimes shifting between factories over time. On the shelf, the tool appears unchanged. Behind the scenes, its origin may be entirely different. OEM switching is not inherently negative. It is a common strategy in high-volume retail. The issue emerges when continuity becomes secondary to cost and availability. Each factory works with its own equipment, workforce, and material sources. Even when designs are shared, execution varies. Small differences in heat treatment, casting methods, or assembly standards can produce noticeable differences in performance. Material substitution further compounds this effect. To manage costs, components may be altered incrementally, slightly softer steel, thinner housings, simplified electronics. None of these changes alone would be obvious to a casual buyer. Visually, the tool remains familiar. Functionally, its margins for error shrink. Under light use, the difference may never surface. Under stress, it does. Faster production cycles also play a role. As demand increases, the pressure to shorten lead times grows. Speed favors throughput over refinement. Processes that once allowed for more inspection or adjustment are streamlined. Tolerance ranges widen, meaning parts that technically meet specifications are accepted even if they sit closer to failure thresholds. This is why two identical-looking tools can behave so differently. One batch might come from a factory with tighter controls and better materials. Another may meet the same written standard, but with less consistency. Both are within spec, yet their real-world performance diverges. Importantly, this shift is systemic, not malicious. Private label scale rewards flexibility and cost control. The trade-off is variability. As Harbor Freight expanded and optimized its supply chain, quality stopped being a fixed promise and became a range. That range is what customers began to feel, even if they couldn't see it. Behind every product decision sits a cost equation that becomes harder to balance as scale increases. Over time, Harbor Freight faced the same pressures affecting the rest of global manufacturing. Inflation raised the price of raw materials, packaging, and transportation. Shipping costs fluctuated sharply, especially for heavy goods like tools, where weight directly affects margins. Even small increases at each stage added up quickly when multiplied across millions of units. Materials themselves became more expensive and less predictable. Steel prices moved unevenly. Electronic components faced supply disruptions, and labor costs rose in manufacturing regions and at home. These pressures didn't appear all at once, but they accumulated. Absorbing them entirely would have required visible price increases that risked breaking the brand's value image. This is where incentives begin to shift. In high-volume retail, durability is not always the most economical outcome. Making a tool last significantly longer often requires disproportionate investment, better materials, slower production, tighter inspection. The cost of those improvements can exceed the financial impact of a certain level of failure. Warranty math makes this clear. If only a small percentage of tools are returned or replaced, the total cost of those failures may be lower than the cost of upgrading every unit. From a system perspective, occasional failure becomes an acceptable variable rather than a flaw to eliminate. As long as return rates stay within projected limits, the model holds. Margin protection, then, happens quietly. Instead of dramatic price hikes, costs are managed internally through sourcing changes, material adjustments, and process efficiencies. To customers, prices appear relatively stable. What changes is what those prices buy. Performance becomes less consistent and longevity less predictable, without a clear signal at the register. None of this requires bad intent. It is a rational response to sustained pressure. The system rewards meeting targets, not exceeding them. Over time, that logic reshapes the product. Harbor Freight tools didn't become cheaper to make because they were worse. They became worse because the system made being consistently better too expensive to sustain at scale. At the center of Harbor Freight's growing tension is a widening gap between expectation and reality. Traditionally, low prices came with an implicit understanding. Customers expected basic performance, limited longevity, and fewer refinements. In return, they accepted trade-offs. The transaction felt fair because the price clearly signaled what the tool was meant to do. Over time, that signal blurred. As prices rose and product lines expanded into better and best tiers, expectations shifted. A tool that costs more is assumed to deliver more consistency, even if it still undercuts competitors. Customers began expecting reliability, not just functionality. The price no longer communicated disposable, but it didn't fully communicate durable either. Employees, however, operate within constraints customers rarely see. Store staff don't control manufacturing decisions, material choices, or production standards. They work with inventory that arrives pre-packaged and pre-priced. When a tool fails, employees can offer returns or replacements, but they cannot resolve the underlying cause. Their role is reactive, not corrective. This is where cheap stops being forgiving. When prices are extremely low, failure feels tolerable. When prices rise, even modestly, failure feels personal. The same outcome produces a different emotional response. What was once accepted as a risk becomes perceived as a defect. Both sides are acting rationally. Customers expect more because they are paying more. Employees follow policy and process because that is what the system allows. The friction isn't driven by unreasonable behavior, it's driven by misaligned assumptions. The gap becomes most visible in use cases. Tools bought for occasional tasks are pushed into heavier duty because they look capable and cost more than before. When they fall short, disappointment follows. The promise customers hear is stronger than the promise the product can keep. That mismatch, more than any single failure, makes conflict inevitable. There is a precise moment when low price stops feeling like an advantage and starts feeling like a risk. For Harbor Freight, that moment emerges not from absolute cost, but from comparison. As prices rise, customers naturally begin measuring Harbor Freight tools against alternatives from Home Depot, Amazon, and other retailers. When the difference narrows, the calculation changes. A tool priced far below competitors invites tolerance. A tool priced slightly below invites scrutiny. When the savings shrink to a few dollars, the potential cost of failure becomes part of the decision. Customers begin asking whether the discount compensates for the uncertainty. The answer increasingly depends on what the tool is expected to do. In some categories, failure carries little consequence. A set of clamps, a tarp, or a basic hand tool that underperforms is inconvenient but manageable. In others, the cost of failure outweighs the savings immediately. Jack stands, power tools, torque-sensitive equipment, and safety-related items occupy a different mental category. If failure risks damage, injury, or wasted time, price loses its appeal. This is the psychological breakpoint. The brand's original strength was that price eliminated hesitation. The purchase felt obvious. As prices moved upward and alternatives became more competitive, hesitation returned. Customers paused. They read reviews, they compared warranties, they asked whether saving a small amount justified accepting uncertainty. That pause is critical. It signals a shift from impulse to evaluation. Harbor Freight still often wins on price, but it no longer wins automatically. The value proposition must now compete on reliability, not just cost. When cheap becomes risky, customers don't necessarily leave immediately. They segment, they decide which tools are safe to gamble on and which are not. That mental sorting marks the moment when trust stops being universal and becomes conditional. Once inconsistency becomes normalized, a feedback loop begins to form. Tool failures lead directly to returns. Individually, each return seems minor, even expected. At scale, they become a measurable cost. Processing returns requires labor, logistics, restocking, and often replacement. None of this generates revenue, but all of it consumes margin. As return volumes rise, operational costs follow. Stores must allocate more staff time to customer service. Warehouses handle increased reverse logistics. Inventory planning becomes more complex, as defective or returned items disrupt forecasts. These costs don't appear on price tags, but they weigh heavily on the system. To offset that pressure, cost control intensifies elsewhere. Materials are reevaluated. Components are simplified. Suppliers are pushed to meet lower targets. Each adjustment is small enough to defend on its own. Together, they reduce production costs just enough to protect margins without forcing obvious price increases. The problem is that these adjustments often increase variability. Cheaper materials and wider tolerances raise the likelihood of failure. That leads to more returns, which feeds back into higher operational costs. The loop reinforces itself. What began as a way to manage pressure becomes a source of it. Breaking this cycle is difficult because the incentives are misaligned. Improving quality across the board requires upfront investment that may not immediately reduce returns enough to justify the expense. Meanwhile, the system continues to function. Tools still sell, most still work, and prices remain competitive. There is no single moment that demands intervention. This is why the decline feels gradual rather than catastrophic. The system degrades while remaining operational. Each loop tightens the constraints a little more. As long as the model holds, the pressure remains internal. By the time customers feel the full effect, the loop has already become part of how the business operates. The most significant shift for Harbor Freight isn't anger, it's indifference. Over time, many customers didn't leave loudly or dramatically. They adjusted their language instead. "I only buy disposable tools here. It's a gamble now." These statements don't express outrage. They signal lowered expectations. Brand confidence erodes quietly. Customers stop assuming a tool will work and start assuming it might not. The purchase becomes conditional. Tools are chosen not because they are trusted, but because the risk feels acceptable for a specific task. That mindset narrows the brand's role in the customer's life. This change is subtle but dangerous. Anger motivates feedback, complaints, and attempts to fix the relationship. Indifference does not. When customers feel emotionally detached, they don't argue. They simply stop choosing the brand for anything that matters. The exit, when it happens, is gradual. A Harbor Freight tool is replaced with an alternative for a critical job, then another, The store becomes a backup, not a destination. Visits become less frequent. Spending becomes more cautious. None of this triggers a visible crisis. Internally, the business can continue operating while trust drains away. Sales don't collapse overnight. Returns remain manageable. The warning signs are behavioral, not financial. By the time they appear clearly in numbers, the perception has already shifted. Trust isn't lost in a single failure. It dissolves through repetition. When uncertainty becomes part of the expectation, the brand stops feeling reliable, even if most tools still work. That quiet loss of confidence is the real crisis. Because once trust becomes conditional, it is rarely restored completely. Markets rarely leave gaps unfilled. As confidence in Harbor Freight becomes more conditional, alternatives quietly reposition to absorb the demand. Home Depot's house brands are one clear response. By offering multiple tiers, entry, mid-range, and professional, these brands aim to combine predictable quality with broad availability. Prices are higher, but consistency becomes part of the value proposition. Amazon fills a different role. Its tool brands and marketplace sellers emphasize convenience, reviews, and fast replacement. For many customers, the ability to compare experiences instantly reduces uncertainty. Even when quality varies, the feedback loop is visible, and returns are frictionless. That transparency shifts risk away from the buyer. Used tools and local shops occupy another segment. For customers wary of inconsistent new tools, second-hand, professional-grade equipment becomes attractive. A used, well-built tool with known wear can feel safer than a new but unpredictable one. Local repair shops and independent retailers benefit from this logic, offering guidance and service rather than just price. The market also becomes more segmented. Professionals gravitate toward reliability and warranty-backed performance, accepting higher costs as part of their workflow. DIY users split into categories: those willing to gamble for low stakes and those who prefer fewer purchases with higher confidence. Each group seeks clarity about what they are buying. In response, alternatives reposition value. Instead of competing solely on price, they compete on certainty, support, and lifespan. The gap. Harbor Freight leaves isn't about cost alone. It's about assurance. When trust weakens, value shifts toward whoever can make outcomes feel predictable again. Harbor Freight can still make sense when the use case is clear and the risk is controlled. The key is understanding where inconsistency is tolerable and where it isn't. Tools that perform simple, low-stress tasks tend to remain the safest purchases. Basic hand tools, clamps, storage solutions, tarps, creepers, and non-precision accessories generally deliver acceptable value. If failure would be inconvenient but not costly, the price advantage still works in the customer's favor. Consumables also fit this category. Items designed to wear out, gloves, zip ties, abrasives, disposable brushes, align well with the brand's model. Expectations are limited, and replacement is part of normal use. In these cases, Harbor Freight's pricing still provides clear savings without introducing meaningful downside. Risk increases sharply with tools where failure carries consequences. Jack stands, torque wrenches, high-speed power tools, and anything tied to safety or precision require a different evaluation. In these categories, inconsistent performance can lead to damage, wasted time, or injury. The savings may appear attractive, but the cost of failure often exceeds the initial discount. These are the areas where customers increasingly look elsewhere. Shopping strategically matters. Harbor Freight's internal tiering system exists for a reason. Higher tier lines are generally built to tighter standards, though still within the same cost-driven framework. Sales and coupons can shift the value equation temporarily, making mid-tier tools more attractive when discounted. Timing matters as much as selection. Use case discipline is critical. Tools intended for occasional specific tasks are safer bets than tools expected to handle repeated or heavy-duty work. Matching the tool to its realistic workload reduces disappointment. Buying with a return strategy in mind can also mitigate risk, but relying on returns as part of normal ownership signals a fragile value proposition. Harbor Freight seen is the right choice when price clearly outweighs uncertainty and the stakes are low. It becomes the wrong choice when reliability is essential and failure would carry real consequences. The brand still serves a purpose, but only when approached with clear boundaries and informed expectations. Harbor Freight isn't broken in the traditional sense. It still operates, still expands, and still serves millions of customers. What has changed is the balance that once defined it. The brand no longer sits clearly in the space it originally occupied. Rising costs, scale, and supply chain pressure reshaped how its tools are made and how consistent they can be. This shift isn't the result of moral failure or deliberate deception. It follows predictable system pressures. High volume, low margin retail leaves little room for error. Decisions that protect the business often introduce variability that customers eventually feel. The outcome isn't collapse, but transformation, one that alters expectations on both sides of the counter. Harbor Freight still works for certain users, occasional DIY customers, low-stakes projects, and situations where price matters more than longevity can still align with what the brand offers. For these use cases, the value equation remains intact. Problems arise when the brand is expected to deliver reliability beyond what its system is designed to support. This makes Harbor Freight a useful case study, not an outlier. It shows how trust erodes not through a single mistake, but through accumulation. Understanding that process matters more than assigning blame. This investigation isn't closed. Individual experiences vary, and patterns only emerge when they're shared and compared. Share your experience so we can understand the bigger picture.